Most Americans didn't notice what just happened when Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on Canadian potato products. They saw another chapter of belligerent trade rhetoric, another tweet transformed into policy, another example of America first being tested in practice. But let me be absolutely clear. What occurred was not a demonstration of American strength. It was the public exposure of a structural weakness that Washington has been cultivating for decades, the illusion that economic size substitutes for institutional competence. I've been following American trade policy since the 1980s, and I've seen agreements being built, broken, renegotiated. I've seen entire presidencies dedicated to establishing trust with partners, and I've also seen the exact moment when that trust began being treated as a disposable commodity. What Trump did with Canadian potatoes wasn't strategy. It was an involuntary stress test of the American system, and the system failed spectacularly. Here's what Washington doesn't want to admit. Canada won this trade war before it even began, not through counter tariffs, not through rhetoric, but through something that current American politics profoundly despises: long-term institutional planning. This didn't happen overnight. In the back rooms of Washington, I've talked with trade advisors, food industry lobbyists, processing executives. They all repeat variations of the same story. For years, American trade policy has become increasingly erratic. Agreements negotiated meticulously were discarded by tweet. Tariffs were imposed without consulting those who actually depended on supply chains, predictability, the basic foundation of any serious commercial relationship, evaporated, and Canada was watching. Most Americans didn't notice what just happened when Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on Canadian potato products. They saw another chapter of belligerent trade rhetoric, another tweet transformed into policy, another example of America first being tested in practice. But let me be absolutely clear. What occurred was not a demonstration of American strength. It was the public exposure of a structural weakness that Washington has been cultivating for decades, the illusion that economic size substitutes for institutional competence. I've been following American trade policy since the 1980s. I've seen agreements being built, broken, renegotiated. I've seen entire presidencies dedicated to establishing trust with partners. And I've also seen the exact moment when that trust began being treated as a disposable commodity. What Trump did with Canadian potatoes wasn't strategy. It was an involuntary stress test of the American system. And the system failed spectacularly. Here's what Washington doesn't want to admit. Canada won this trade war before it even began. Not through counter tariffs, not through rhetoric, but through something that current American politics profoundly despises: long-term institutional planning. This didn't happen overnight. In the back rooms of Washington, I've talked with trade advisors, food industry lobbyists, processing executives. They all repeat variations of the same story. For years, American trade policy has become increasingly erratic. Agreements negotiated meticulously were discarded by tweet. Tariffs were imposed without consulting those who actually depended on supply chains, predictability, the basic foundation of any serious commercial relationship, evaporated, and Canada was watching. Robert, third-generation potato farmer on Prince Edward Island. His family has been perfecting techniques since the 1960s, building a reputation with American processors who valued consistency above all else. When the tariff hit, Robert didn't absorb the costs. He called buyers in Japan. He activated contracts in South Korea. Within weeks, his potatoes were sailing west across the Pacific instead of south, across the border. He did this because his business required stability, and America had just announced it would no longer provide it. Jennifer, restaurant owner in Idaho, for years she sourced frozen potato products from processors who relied on Canadian supply, consistent quality, predictable pricing. Then the tariff hit. Costs jumped 25%. Alternative sources were non-existent or inconsistent in quality. Jennifer tried switching to American-grown potatoes and discovered what every food service operator eventually learns. Not all potatoes are equal. Different growing conditions produce different frying characteristics. Her customers noticed. Jennifer found herself trapped between absorbing costs that would destroy her margins or passing them along to customers who would simply go elsewhere. She wasn't fighting ideology, and she was fighting mathematics. And mathematics doesn't care about political messaging. David, processing plant manager in Maine, his facility employs 300 people. For 20 years, it has depended on Canadian potatoes because they arrived with Swiss watch consistency, disease-resistant varieties, proper storage, reliable transportation. The entire operation calibrated around that predictability. When the tariff disrupted supply, David panicked. He contacted American growers. He discovered that you cannot conjure agricultural capacity out of thin air. Growing potatoes requires specific soil, climate, expertise. Processing them requires equipment calibrated to particular varieties. Quality control systems take years to develop. He faced a choice: shut down lines and lay off workers, or find new supply sources. He chose the latter. But those sources weren't in America. They were in Canada, selling to processors in Asia. 3 people, 1 shared reality. When political decisions ignore institutional complexity, real people pay the price. Think about that. Here's what actually happened in the first days after the tariff announcement. While Washington was celebrating another demonstration of strength, Canadian producers were executing contingency plans developed over years of watching American trade policy become structurally unpredictable. They didn't improvise, they prepared, and when the moment came, they were ready. Meanwhile, American processors discovered the uncomfortable truth that interdependence works both ways. Building alternatives takes time, investment, and expertise you may not possess. The food service industry operates on assumptions of stability, and when those assumptions shatter, the system doesn't smoothly adjust. It stumbles. When you talk with people inside the American food industry, not the official spokespersons, but the operations managers, the buyers, the logistics people, they describe the weeks following the tariff with one word: chaos. Not the productive chaos of strategic reorganization, the destructive chaos of systems breaking because someone in Washington decided that supply chains are political props. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill with a message nobody wanted to hear. This tariff is costing us more than it's cost in Canada. Our prices are rising, our workers are at risk, and the supposed leverage we're gaining, it doesn't exist because Canada found other buyers, and we can't find other suppliers at the quality and scale we need. Absolute that. Here's the parallel that nobody in Washington wants to make, but that needs to be made. In the 1970s, when Nixon imposed price controls and wage freezes, the logic was simple. The president has the power to reorganize the economy through decree. The reality was different. Markets don't obey rhetoric. They obey incentives, mathematics, operational physics. The controls created shortages, black markets, distortions that took years to correct. The potato tariff follows the same imperial logic. The president has the power to reorganize supply chains through decree, but supply chains aren't built by decrees. They're built by decades of relationships, investments, technical expertise. When you break that without building an alternative, you don't create leverage, you create chaos. The difference is that in the 1970s, the U.S. was still a dominant enough economy to absorb its own incompetence. In 2025, that margin of error has evaporated because while Washington was busy treating trade as political theater, the rest of the world was building alternatives to the U.S., and Canada proved to be a particularly attentive student. Here's the third tipping point, the one that changes everything. While Washington was focused on pressuring Canada, Canada was building something infinitely more valuable, a diversified agricultural export system that didn't depend on American predictability. They didn't announce this, they didn't hold press conferences, and they just quietly built the capacity to walk away from an unreliable relationship. This wasn't luck. This was institutional wisdom, the kind that comes from being a smaller economy next to a larger, more volatile one, the kind that says, never let one partner control your fate. So when the tariff hit, they were ready, not because they predicted this specific tariff, but because they understood that American trade policy had become structurally unpredictable. The result? Canadian potato exports to Asia jumped 40% within months. Processing capacity pivoted toward markets that offered long-term stability, and American processors watched those relationships flow elsewhere, not because of price, because of trust. And trust, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. If this had occurred in another country, say if Turkey had imposed a sudden tariff on Greek products, watched its own industry enter crisis, and then seen Greece redirect exports to more reliable markets, Washington would call it by its correct name, strategic self-harm masqueraded as strength. But when it happens here, we call it robust trade policy. The logic is the same, and the tolerance is what changed. Great powers don't decline because they lose military conflicts. They decline because they stop understanding how their own prosperity is built. They confuse size with strength. They confuse rhetoric with strategy. And then one day they wake up to discover the world reorganized itself while they were busy making speeches. I've seen this before. I saw it when trust in the dollar as a reserve currency was treated as a natural right instead of a privilege requiring constant maintenance. I saw it when relationships with European allies were treated as optional because they need us more than we need them. I saw it when American foreign policy began operating on the premise that consequences are for small countries. And now I'm seeing it with potatoes, not oil, not semiconductors, not cutting-edge technology, French fries, and even in this basic product, the U.S. discovered it cannot simply decree supply chain realignment without paying an institutional price. Here's what Washington doesn't understand. In a globalized economy, reliability isn't a moral luxury, it's a measurable competitive advantage. Countries and companies make risk calculations. When a partner demonstrates structural unpredictability, they build insurance against that unpredictability. And that insurance has a name: partner diversification. Canada built that insurance quietly, methodically, over years. And when the test came, it passed. Not because it was stronger than the U.S., but because it was prepared. And preparation, when it confronts improvisation, wins every time. The tariff was eventually modified. Political pressure from American industries made continuing it impossible. But the damage was done. Canadian growers had found new buyers. American processors had absorbed losses. And a broader message was sent to every trading partner: America's word is subject to change without notice. That message carries consequences far beyond potatoes. It shapes how other nations calculate risk when considering long-term partnerships with the United States. It determines whether in future crises America will have partners willing to cooperate or competitors who have learned to function without us. Robert, the Prince Edward Island farmer, didn't just survive the tariff, he thrived. His pivot to Asian markets opened opportunities he hadn't imagined. The tariff that was supposed to pressure him actually freed him from dependence on an unreliable partner. Jennifer, the Idaho restaurant owner, struggled. Her costs rose, her customers complained, her margins shrank, all because of political decisions made without understanding the systems they would impact. David, the processing plant manager, made a hard choice. He invested in new supplier relationships outside North America. His plant survived, but the jobs that depended on Canadian supply didn't come back because the relationships that sustained them had moved elsewhere. 3 people, 3 outcomes, 1 lesson. When political decisions ignore institutional reality, the people doing the actual work pay the price while policymakers move on to the next headline. This is the choice America faces. Continue treating trade relationships as political leverage and watch as partners build insurance against your unpredictability, or recognize that in a world of integrated supply chains, reliability is the only competitive advantage that lasts. Canada chose reliability. It built it quietly over years of patient investment, and when the test came, it passed. America chose rhetoric. And rhetoric, when it collides with the mathematical realities of modern trade, loses every time. The line has been crossed. The precedent has been written in permanent ink, not just about potatoes, but about how the world calculates American trustworthiness. Every trading partner watched. Each took their own notes. Each is, at this moment, executing their own contingency plans. Because the potato war taught the lesson that Washington refuses to learn. In 2025, power doesn't come from the ability to impose costs, it comes from the ability to absorb them, and by that metric, a Canadian province proved more resilient than the superpower to its south. And history is not usually kind to empires that confuse territorial size with institutional competence.